This June 2nd through the 7th, join acclaimed potter and instructor David McDonald at Snow Farm for Put a Lid on It, Tops for Ceramic Vessels. This hands-on workshop focuses on the design and making of well-fitting lids for pots made on the wheel. At Snow Farm, you'll dine on fresh handmade food, connect with a creative community, and advance your craft. Snow Farm offers 2 to 5 day workshops in 9 topic areas in a contemporary farm setting in Williamsburg, Massachusetts. Registration for all 2024 workshops is now open, so sign up today at snowfarm.org. Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 509 of the podcast, and also welcome back to season 13. We have just passed our 12th birthday, so I wanted to thank all the folks that have been tuning in for all those years. To celebrate the anniversary of the podcast, I've launched a fund drive, as I often do at the beginning of these seasons. If you can, go to talesofaredclayrambler.com/donate, where you can make a pledge through our PayPal portal. You can also become a sustaining member at patreon.com/redclayrambler, and there's tons of perks for becoming a patron, including t-shirts, posters, as well as access to the Tales from the Vault podcast feed, which features episodes that are no longer available on major podcast apps. Also wanted to mention that I've been making a ton of new work, and I'm having a Mother's Day sale on May the 3rd. That's going to launch at 5 p.m., so if you want to check that out, you can go to carterpottery.com. Today on the show, I'm talking with Chen. He makes sculptural and functional forms that reference architecture and biomechanics. In our interview, we talk about how a tennis injury led him to study anatomy, creating sculptures that nest within themselves, and refining a form through repetition. If you'd like to see examples of his work, you can go to bryanchenpottery.com. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. Can you talk about how studying biology and anatomy both, how that has informed your sense of form?
I went to school trying to pursue some type of physical therapy kind of thing. I fall into a category of a bunch of people where they are athletes or doing some type of physical activity and they get injured and then they get treated. And then the treatment is usually what starts the initial interest in anatomy. There were a ton of people in my school that were kind of following that same train of thought, and it started this this kind of fascination with like what makes up you, this kind of like pseudo existential kind of what is this thing that carries me through my day, and it's I think there's the fact that it kind of like melds in with it pulls everything, physics, chemistry, biology, in this very like numbers systematic way was it was comforting. I don't know if it's like people take it for granted or like it's not thought about it as much, but like the systematic way that beings move and how they move throughout and how they respond to stimulus is very like observable, and I think those systems are what kind of influence my forms.
It makes sense that the injury kind of sparked that study for you because I think, like most people, have no idea about how your tendon works until you pull one. And then you're like, wait, why is my elbow or why is my ankle, why is my wrist all of a sudden floppy when it wasn't before and it hurts like hell?
I find the same type of like in awe feeling when I see like well designed architecture or a well designed object where like certain lines and forms imply some type of meaning or function. And it's the same thing that goes on in the body, and I think it's beautiful. I don't know.
Let's talk architecture because actually the way that you articulate the edges, like for the listener, we should describe like a lot of your forms will have kind of a curvilinear line that will cross a vessel in some way. And then from that line, there'll be another swooping curve, almost like an architectural element that goes down to either more lines or something that's almost reminiscent of buildings or shells or, pods, like sometimes seed pods. It kind of has that vibe. But I wanted to talk about the architectural part. Like, how did you? It's one thing to say in your head, like, okay, I'm going to make a pot that looks like X. Figuring out how to build it, though, is different. And I think architecture often kind of gives hints at how to build things. So, what have you learned from concrete architecture, stone architecture, things like that, that you can apply in the studio?
So I think the biggest thing that I took from school, at least in this architecture sense, I didn't enjoy the class, but I did take history of modern architecture. Um, and it was really just the initial viewing of how monumental buildings can be, but how the feel of it or look of it can change based off of how it was built. It can feel really heavy, it can feel really lifted. And then also just finding bones on the ground. The kind of the way to really convince myself that something is truly an object and not something sitting on a table is lifting it. And that lift, it's so uh like most pots are circles sitting on a table, and the first step is to lift it and then start building supports. After taking the class and then walking through cities, um I started to pay more attention to how things are built, and stuff makes a lot of sense with massive concrete pillars or scaffolding, even scaffolding outside of buildings in New York City. Like there's a logical reason for why they're built the way they are, and the temporariness of the whole thing also makes sense to me. Um, but I think architecture carries a lot of hints at the reason something can be supported at the top is there was something supporting it at the bottom. And I don't know, I think it all kind of translates down to like a very physical world. There's like general, I don't know if they're laws of physics that you can work with that help you build most things.
I think part of your building style also is an intuitive sense of form. So, we're talking about, I agree, there are laws of physics that do affect clay, especially when you're firing it and things start to get pyroclastic in the kiln. But I think it still, though, goes back to your eye and what looks beautiful to you. I wanted to talk about you posted a video recently of a big kind of swooping form that comes up off of the banding wheel. And then there's another almost like egg form that rests in that. So, can you talk just about the thought process of designing that thing, and then how you actually build a two-part vessel that will actually fit together?
Part of my understanding of how the volumes and lines are moving is this kind of implied, like the lines have to make sense with the interaction. So all those, gently tapered curving lines cupping the thing are cupped towards the pod or egg form. And I think it's it's to my understanding, it's a relatively repeated form in nature. When things are being held, some part of the lines are reference to the thing that it's holding or the thing that it's attached to, in this very, you know, physiological relationship or anatomical relationship kind of way. And that's the initial thought. These two things have to visually look like they are meant to interact together. Um, and with that particular piece, I think I was scrolling through Instagram and I had screenshotted a glass piece, um, with just kind of this diagonal sectioning off of color. I don't know if it was Pinterest or something else. Um, but that's usually the start of most things. The of most things that I build. Um, the things like when I look at all these elements, uh, in my head, I'm making up some abstract or hypothetical reason that it should exist. And I think that opens up interpretation, like a pretty varied interpretation of how people read my work. Because it doesn't really, it's not a real thing, but it's kind of based in this feeling that it should interact. It's referenced enough to nature, but vague enough that leaves it open enough for interpretation. Um, but that's at least how they're started, and then they're tweaked as I build so that it hopefully doesn't fail.
Well, before we talk about failure, because it sounds like that's happened before, could you talk about how that thing meets the banding wheel? Like how the base. Because you said before in architecture, what's at the top is supported by what's at the bottom. We kind of know that, but there's still lots of options for how you can make a sculptural form meet the table.
The first time I built that form was is not the same as how I built it now, but I was watching my friend Chris, who's I think he's teaching in Chicago. I think they're teaching in Chicago. And they had kind of pinched out these, I want to call them like red blood cell shaped. It's like a donut, but the inside is kind of tapered in. And I start off with those as supports. I line them with plastic, and then I pinch out a little cup into those donuts, and then I start building from there. And then the very center of the pod, but the center of all 3 feet will have a support. And then on both of the narrow sides, I don't know if that makes sense verbally. But there are supports as the piece gets wider, at its widest to kind of support the early flop, um, before it starts to taper in at the top. And there's also like an open bowl cone form on the interior, instead of your classic kind of 3D printed lattice structure. There's a cup form that holds the bottom of the socket.
Right. Okay. As soon as you said socket, that is the way you explain. That is the way that these forms go together. They go together like a ball and socket in your knee or
Yes.
shoulder. When I say they go together, they don't touch like a lid. They touch like they hug each other, which I think the visual part of that references the human body, but it also made me think about relationships, like how, like intimacy with someone you love, like an embrace. So, is there some emotional component in terms of meaning with the way you're using these symbols?
Yes, I think that there is. Um, I think it's early in terms of how I've started to think about the emotional side of that work. Um, I think I think back when I started writing, um, when I was with Simon, he had an early crit with me, where these kind of the aesthetic of like two things interacting and holding each other started to develop. He had an early crit where he brought up the word violence and calm. There's just kind of this relationship between the two. Um, and while the words violence and calm aren't used now, and it's not what I would use for my work right now, I think there is a bit of, personal turmoil uh related to like identity and race and family troubles growing up, that I'm still kind of thinking about, that I don't know if I could articulate it in the best way, but there is a component of uh there's these two sides, and I don't know if it's like growing up as an Asian American kind of in the suburbs of Jersey and then coming home to like a very Taiwanese culture and having like yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I've like sat with it enough to really like solidify words about it. But I do think that there's something there.
Yeah, and I think as artists, we literally think through our work. Like we make work, and it is a sometimes can be a act of self revelation as other people respond to it, and then you get a critique from someone, and they say, "Oh, this reminds me of that," and in your head or in my head, I often go, "Oh no, it means this," but without that critique, I never would have been able to put my finger on what it meant, because in my mind, I'm just jazzed about making it. Like I think as artists, we follow the passion and then the intellect comes after that.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that makes sense. Can you talk a little bit about the failure aspect of the forms? Like as you're building these things, I think you even said like sometimes you got to build it twice because the first time doesn't doesn't work.
Yeah, for those first forms, I tried to guess and check the fit. So I would build the socket piece and then try to rebuild the base of the socket. I would try to like replicate the curve, that is on a separate base, and then build the pod off of that separate base to see if I could fit it. And that ended up being the pod ended up being too big. So then I panic tried to lop off part of the supporting socket and then fit the pod in and then reattach it, and it was way too dry. So I just said, fuck it, it's not gonna work. Um and then the second time, I didn't have a cup form supporting the socket on the inside structure. I had one wall going across long ways. Um and then the second time I tried to build it, I tried the same way, but I made the socket smaller. And then instead of the single wall going across long ways on the inside support, I had a Y split for the 2 feet, because it's got 2 feet on one side and 1 foot on the other. And I was still getting cracking in the socket, and then the pod was way too small and it kind of looked like a crab claw. Um, and then actually the way that this was figured out, was the programming manager over at Carbondale wanted to make a platter workshop for Thanksgiving, and I tried to rush out 8 bisque molds for a workshop in maybe like a week and a half, and I exploded 5 of them. Um, and then Diane Kenny, who is the founder of Carbondale Clay Center, uh, told me about easy platters you can make by rolling out coils and then laying a tablecloth over the thing and then laying a slab inside the the coil tablecloth setup.
Ah, okay. Like using the tension of the tablecloth to make the curve of the slab.
Yeah. And the edge of the platter would be raised by the coil. So then I just thought, why don't I just line the socket with a bed sheet and then just hand build from inside there. And if everything is supported properly, it should be fine. So that was how I fixed it, and then I changed the inside structure to be a like a rounded cup instead of like linear grids.
I love to hear how work teaches us how it should exist. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like you make something and the act of making informs the later bodies of work. And I was actually scrolling down far in your Instagram to see like how did your work evolve over time. And it seems like you work in iteration, both with pots, like slowly changing forms, but the sculptures also seem to not necessarily series, but that there are sort of improvements on previous ideas. How do you keep excited for an idea when you got to remake it? Does that make sense? Like
Yes.
how do you keep the passion going if you've already failed once or twice, but you got to make it?
I think that feeling of success is way higher than getting something right on the first time. I There was a little bit of like so coming out of Simon's apprenticeship, he kind of he set me up really well with like a tool belt of questions for self-critique. And then he also helps you not kind of feel settled with your work. And then he also knew how to uh push me in this way to like and I think this has always been a thing that I carried with me, but like I want to get it right. And I've gotten really comfortable knowing that my first few times will be wrong. But the itch to get it right will not leave my brain until I feel satisfied. Um, so I can go into the first attempt at something knowing that I'll probably have a fifth attempt, however good or bad the first one feels. And I've gotten pretty comfortable knowing that I could maybe get there, but just not on the first one.
I like that idea of managing expectations from the beginning. I mean, it totally makes sense. Like, why would you be able to build a complex form on the first try? Like, that's not realistic. But I think sometimes as artists, we can have unrealistic expectations of what success with a form looks like or surface. I mean, I've also made beautiful pots and really screwed them up with the surface.
Surface has been hard for me. It doesn't make quite as much sense relative to form.
Yeah, there's sometimes you use texture to accentuate transitions between things. So like one part of the resting sculpture will have like it almost looks like a hatch mark, like the very subtle texture, and then another part of the form will be smooth, so that even though they fit together, like say the mug is your mug form that you've been making recently. The cup of it is smooth, but then the bottom part that it kind of nestles down or visually looks like it's nestling down into, that part has some texture. So, can you talk about the value of working with texture versus, say, color, where you're just making the two different parts different colors?
A lot of my coming at least coming out of atmospheric and exploring soda a little bit, a lot of my color versus texture versus kind of surface design and consideration exploration um is kind of based in contrast. If there's any amount of visual contrast, it kind of helps sell the idea that they're two separate things. um and that's kind of been the basis of how I'm trying to explore. But with the color versus texture, I think I don't know if it's the transition from sculpture to texture versus sculpture to color is just a little easier for me because there's the the tactile quality or the texture of something will also inform how it's used, how it behaves, how it responds. Um, in a way that I think just makes a little more sense to me before I start to approach color. Because most of what I'm looking at is like this, and it ranges anywhere from like this sun baked white to like a really gnarly, meaty covered, dirty, creamy white brown thing. I think at the end of the day, I'm just looking for contrast because coming out of atmospheric, everything was kind of the same value. Yeah.
I think also with a longer style of you've mentioned Simon, but you were an apprentice with Simon Levin, and that style of firing you can get a long flame and some pretty active ash pattern, even if it's dry. It's not like they're super wet or glossy when they're fired, but that long flame is going to have a pattern that wraps around the form. But in a way, you're already setting the wrapping of the form by the way you're building it. Like it doesn't necessarily need that extra thing. The form speaks strong enough that it doesn't need a wood-fired surface on top of the form.
Yeah, so that was actually the first time I had heard something like that was from Stuart Gare. He was just checking out one of my unloads in Carbondale, and he had just was gravitating more towards a glazed form than he was a flashed form. And I was still messing around with flashing slips. And that was kind of when I first started to really consider moving away from flashing. Um, and it kind of helped me lean more in like I've never viewed atmospheric firing as a crutch, but it was just what I started with. So it's just the thing in your brain. Um, and I think that's when I like started to feel way more comfortable leaning into form and getting comfortable exploring that and not dropping color and texture, but just kind of like being comfortable setting that aside because realistically not everyone is going to be great at everything, and I'm just going to lean into what I'm enjoying, and then still consider color and texture but kind of chip away at that a little more slowly.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of over 4,000 objects made by over 1,000 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfieldcollection.com.
The Bray Clay business is your best source for Bray epoxy, a two-part moldable epoxy intended for post-firing repairs. Working like clay, it's easy to shape, texture, fill gaps, and recreate missing parts. Bray epoxy is sold in tan, white, and black base colors, and we also have a 9-color kit that will allow you to perfectly disguise your repair. Order online anytime at archiebrayclay.com.
Can you talk about being a business person and making a living off of the work? Because, we talked about the sculptural work. We started talking about that. But then you make great functional pots. And like the mug form, that's something that I was really drawn to because it's resolved. Like it feels, you could make literally like 100,000 of these mugs where the handle looks like bone and comes off the form and comes down to the base, which also kind of looks like bone. And you could sell those all day long. That is an accessible piece that has some of the aesthetic that is in your sculpture, but it doesn't cost as much. Versus the sculptures, I'm sure, a lot more money. So how do you balance that, knowing that you got to pay bills every month in terms of what you're going to make and what you can sell?
So I am still figuring this out. uh yeah, so I'm still learning how sculpture moves. Um and I'm also trying to find a balance that feels good between making functional stuff and sculptural stuff. Because in some uncomfortable confidence, I really enjoy the mugs that I make, but I can't really compete with people who can crank out 40 in a day because my batch size is anywhere between like 6 to 12, and that gets that I need at least 4 to 5 days. Um so yeah, it's something that I'm still learning. I think I have to get a little, I don't know if I have to find my market with sculpture, um and then kind of balance that out with functional. um but yeah, I don't know. I've got a lot of thoughts about what small business means to me. I have moved back to my parents' place, so I'm working out of their basement. So in luckily my bills are a little lower, and I have a bit of freedom to try to explore what is small business. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I want to keep teaching in mind. I want to keep long form, at least longer form content in mind. Um, in addition to sculpture and functional work. And then also getting to know the East Coast clay scene. I don't really know it that well. So yeah, there's still a lot to consider. Yeah, my answer is that I'm still learning.
No, that's an honest answer, and I, even though I'm older than you, I'm still learning.
Mhm.
For me, it's not sculpture, and I mean everything I make is pots, but it's how do you balance higher priced items with lower priced items? Because my studio is so small and my house is not that big either. Like I need things to move. Like I never have that much inventory because I don't have much space. So I can send them out to galleries, but then the balance point is like if I sell them myself, I keep more money. So I feel like this is all a work in progress for every business person. But I heard you say in an interview that one of the things you got from Simon being his apprentice was just understanding how a business could work. Not necessarily that you're copying his, but just that you have a business and there's a plan. So can you talk a little bit about that, like what you learned from him on the business side of things?
I learned about the many hats that you wear as a small business owner with a family. I think very early on, because I'd started in February, we're entering tax season. Simon invited me over to just kind of look at some numbers, which was not something I was expecting at all in terms of a an apprenticeship, but the reality of that I think was something that was pretty eye opening, to just start an apprenticeship and sit at a computer and look at numbers. Um, but I had also started doing a little bit of marketing with his one pot a day thing. And then kind of that being tied into keeping and tracking inventory. Um, in addition to standard reclaim, glaze, studio cleaning, tech work. Um, and I think getting to just like passively observe how many different things can pull you away from the studio, I think kind of gave me a pretty good standard for the kind of bouncing aroundness of small business. Um, and it's not to say that I have the best understanding or enough confidence to like plow through this new journey with confidence and ease, but I think I have a pretty good realistic understanding of what is making time versus what is not. um and I think that was probably the biggest thing, because a lot of what I was doing for Simon were the things that pulled him away from the studio. And similar to being the glaze tech in any other studio, you get used to being the glaze tech. So in that way, I don't feel that bothered being pulled away from the studio because I know it's something that needs to be done.
With the 1 pot a day posting, can you talk about that? Because I remember watching those and going like, "Huh, that's a good pot." So, could you talk about that as a way of being on Instagram?
I don't know if it had just started when I started, or I was the first one. But Simon just wanted to move inventory, and had me start the page, and I did. And I think what I got out of that, it did later become a slog. It did later start to feel like work, but outside of just posting the pot and making sure inventory was organized, he gave me the freedom to just do whatever, which helped me approach it in a much more relaxed way, and also helped me kind of mess around with like how to take pictures of pots outside, or just like the it became the the like it was in my schedule to just go outside with a week's worth of pots and just look for ways to document them. um and it's helped me like relax about Instagram, um uh in a way that like doesn't feel like each post is super precious. um and I think that's translated a little bit into how I approach Instagram. It's very much just a business tool. um and it's like an honest, open, relaxed way of how I want my work to be viewed. uh yeah, I don't know, it was a fun time posting all those spots for Simon.
We should say if people want to look at it, it's the number 1 pot a day. They can find it on Instagram. And I like you mentioned that it makes you be creative because you're taking pictures of pots in all different environments. So some were literally outside in the snow or on a table or whatever. But I find with Instagram having some ritualization of it helps. So I'm always posting about the people I interview on the podcast, but just having like that ritual of like, okay, I got to post this person. How am I going to best describe their work with 1 or 2 images? That's kind of like the 1 pot a day thing where it's like, okay, we all know what a pot looks like, but how can we make this visually dynamic day after day after day after day?
Yeah.
I wanted to end talking about your time being a tennis player, actually. We talked a while ago about you had an injury, but I know with tennis, like it's a solo sport. I mean, you can be playing doubles, but it's largely a solo sport, and it's mental. I grew up playing tennis. I've played a lot of tennis, and I've seen so many tennis stars, essentially go from being the best in the world to starting to fall down the rankings, not because their body failed, but because their mind failed. Like the focus necessary to be obsessed, essentially, that started to fade over time. So can you talk about your experience creating focus in tennis and then how that applies to what you do now in the studio?
I think like, umbrella bird's eye view of it is clay has very much replaced tennis in terms of like daily routine and intensity of it. But I grew up playing tennis. It was just the one sport that I played. And I was a very technical, aggressive player, and my mental game was the worst part of my game. I in college I think, and in high school I was, there's always like a bit of a hothead on the team, the one guy in the team that just like can't hold it together. um and that was me. um a little bit entertaining, more distracted by the crowd and whether or not they're behaving than my opponent. If there's an opportunity for a tweener, I might take it. And then, my coach will make me do 10 push-ups in the middle of the match because I shouldn't have done that.
Can
And I
you
know that.
explain what that is for people that don't play tennis? What a tweener is?
Yeah. So a tweener, the way a tweener is set up, you're at a tennis court. If I'm standing up in the net and then my opponent hits a lob over me, and it lands in, so I have to run backwards. My back is facing the net, and I let the ball drop between my legs, still with my back facing the net, and I hit it through my legs back over the net, hopefully. It's a risky shot, it's a stupid shot. It has its moments. There's a 5% chance you can try to justify it to someone. And then hopefully that someone is your coach, and hopefully they don't make you do push-ups. I mean, I haven't played tennis since college, with some amount of burnout. But I do definitely appreciate what tennis has given me. It's an incredibly technical sport. It kind of puts all the responsibility on you to kind of think about how to win, how to, play to your strengths and exploit weaknesses, at least in this 1v1 scenario. And it puts all the responsibility on you to kind of get yourself through the match. And the kind of technicality of it and the solo responsibility of it, I think, is translated into clay. Like I know that I'm the only person that cares enough about this imperfection about my work to try to do it again one more time. The idea of one more, as if you're being coached and you're just drilling a basket of balls, and kind of in tandem with like working in series and knowing that I'm going to make a mistake, but the next one could be better, I think is something that I carry through all of my creative endeavors. The idea of one more. If you can learn something from the previous one and then try to consider it in the next one, something is going to change. I don't know what it is. It might work out, it might not. But if you just get that one more thing done, you can at least respond to it again.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And there's parts of, like, let's talk about the tennis racket itself. Like you string a racket under tension, and the tension is what gives you power. I mean, also your body movement, but that tension, I'm starting to see that coming into the work. So like there's some of your work recently has had this like woven hemp that comes through points of the sculpture. And then there was this one that almost made like a suspension bridge with the string in the same way you would string a tennis racket, like a web of the material. And then you would rest another object on top of that. And it just makes this tension release feeling, like something is tight enough to hold another object, but loose enough so that round object on the top won't roll off. So can you talk about this woven aspect of the work, like how the ideas behind that?
It kind of came from tennis again. I think back in the middle of middle school, I started to string my own tennis rackets just because it was more affordable. Because I think people would pay something up to like $40 to $50 to go to a club to get it restrung. But then you can try to sink in however many hours to learn to try to do it yourself. But that was kind of the start of this weaving quote unquote practice. And then in college, I took a couple fiber arts classes that kind of focused more on weaving on a loom. So there's a bit of like textiles experience in terms of like, pushing little threads through holes, with or without 40 to 50 pounds of tension on it. And I think it just kind of came a little bit after the fact, like realizing that I had a skill that I don't no longer do, that I can try to involve in sculpture. And I think because I think about bones and muscles and movement, I think I was always at least learning on finding this aesthetic on functional forms. I was always missing this muscle component that's always been in the back of my head, that it's really hard to convey with a really hard material like clay. And I came across a spool of sinew in Wisconsin, and I kept it around with me for a few years until bringing it out with sculpture. But I think it's a combination of all those things, of just like kind of, once I started to lean into sculpture, I realized that I could bring in other materials, and I can finally kind of figure out what muscle is in and how I want muscle to kind of be viewed or portrayed in the bones that I'm making, which kind of lean into this like visual logic of functionality, which is what fascinates me about the body.
And the elements are also so small, like they end up being woven into like a web almost, but the actual like thickness of a piece of sinew or a string of sinew is so small that it also does something interesting with scale in the work. And they're soft, so they're soft and hard, small and large. Like it goes back to what you were saying about contrast, it's just adding another element. And you'd made this one that's like a circular, it looks like almost bones that fit together in an oculus or like a circular form. And then the whole thing is wrapped in a net of this. Mm-hmm. And it's just so beautiful. Like it
Thank
is
you.
just, it is so good. So I look forward to seeing how your use of that evolves over time.
Me too. I'm excited to incorporate more sinew in my work. And right now I'm trying to scale that idea back down into functional stuff, although because it's getting way more complex, it still might be considered sculpture. But I want to play with this idea of like tied up articulated things.
To wrap up, can you leave both your website and social media so people can get in touch?
So my Instagram is at Brian Chen Pottery. That's Brian with an I, CHEN pottery. And my website is the same.com, or not the same.com, but brianchenpottery.com.
Well, thanks, man. This was a real pleasure. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you. I had a good time.
I'd like to thank Brian for coming on the show. It was a pleasure to chat, and I look forward to seeing more of him. We're both based in New Jersey, and as you've heard me say on the podcast before, we're trying to get some momentum with New Jersey ceramics, and I've got something big coming up, but I'm not quite ready to announce it, so look for that announcement in the next couple months. Also wanted to thank today's sponsors. That's Snow Farm, the New England Craft Program, the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art, and Bray Clay. If you'd like to be a sponsor on one of our shows, you can get in touch at brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.